Hi all, this is a video response to a recent video by God Must Die called Are Your Children Paying for Your Principles? Now before I get into the critique of this, I'd just like to say that I really like God Must Die's channel and I usually enjoy his videos very much. And so this response is I'm doing this response in the spirit of goodwill, and essentially what I would like to do is to disagree, as we are all rational adults here, I hope. And I'm probably going to say some things which many people will disagree with. Now, I hope that we can do this in the spirit of, instead of just getting defensive and saying that's ridiculous, I may suggest that you're wrong, and I may suggest even that you're perhaps ignorant on certain topics. Now, I would like this to be taken in the same vein as we would hope theists would take it when we say to them that they are wrong and perhaps ignorant of certain scientific topics. That is, that we will listen to the arguments I present and we'll respond to them in a rational way, and that if my arguments make sense, that you will accept them and move on. With that said, let's get into God Must Die's video.
In the news today is the story of Grayson Bryce, a 9-year-old boy who was bullied for wearing a My Little Pony backpack to school. The school subsequently banned him from wearing it because it was making him a target for bullies, and the usual outrage ensued. In many ways, this story mirrors the tale of anyone who is persecuted for being different, and has close parallels with the ever-contentious issue of female rape, and whether or not it's fair to suggest that the way women dress and the way they behave is a factor in whether or not they are more likely to become targets.
So first of all, I've got to take a couple of issues with what has just been said. The wording of that wearing the backpack was making him a target for the bullies frames everything in terms of the victim's responsibility. Now, I know this is not what you're intending, but it's one of the things that's crept into our culture whereby we, just in simply the way we talk about it, is we remove the bullies from it. So a more accurate way would have been saying that banned him because the bullies were targeting him for his wearing of the backpack. That sounds less reasonable. Although you sort of suggest that it was a sort of it's a knee-jerk automatic response of people to be outraged by this, I'm not outraged, but I do think it was a poor choice. I don't know the ins and outs of the whole situation, but yeah, so I'd like to say that some people at least who are outraged or disagree with this are not just doing it from a knee-jerk response. Now, I actually agree with you that this is very similar to the issue of female rape. It's interesting you talk about female rape and not rape in general, because the suggestion always is that whenever a man is raped, nobody ever asks what the man was wearing or whether that was a factor. Nobody ever asks what the man did to possibly make himself a target of it. And I think that actually is an important point here. Now, it might sound like nitpicking, but the way we talk about these issues actually shows the way that we think about it and the way that these issues are thought of in society in general. And so the fact that we frequently will think about what was the woman doing when she was raped and just prior to it, but we never ask the same question of male rapes, is telling about the way that we do see things differently based on gender, and is a hint that perhaps we're not thinking about it entirely clearly. Other than that, I think it's absolutely right, is that we're talking about people being victimised and whether or not it's reasonable to ask questions about what the victim is doing to perhaps play a part in that. So, on with the video.
Just yesterday I was watching a true crime documentary in which an investigator noted that a murder victim's actions had put her at greater risk. The woman was drunk and walking home alone at night. There was no suggestion that it was the woman's fault that she had been targeted, but clearly her actions increased her vulnerability.
Okay, so here again we see the way it's been framed, that we seemingly naturally ask the question of whether what the victim had done had increased her vulnerability to being murdered. Again, the murderer's actions and choices have been left out of what's been said. Now, again, this might seem trivial, but let's reframe it. So, the question would be, did the victim do anything which would make her more likely to be chosen by the murderer to be murdered? Okay. And here's where we diverge. So the feminist response or the typical feminist response, if there is one, is to say that actually almost certainly not. And even if it had been, that again, it would have played a small part, and at best we might hope that had this person not done that some other person would have been murdered. That is, the murderer was looking to murder, or had the predisposition to murder. And so this would be the sort of typical feminist response. Now, if there is such a thing. Now, a lot of people respond saying, well, no, that's not true. You know, obviously the way they played a role in that, you know, acted and dressed, played a role in them being selected to be, you know, murdered by the murderer. But this is actually, interestingly, this is an evidence-based, this is an empirical claim. This is a claim that can be tested, and rarely do people actually look for any evidence of this. Interestingly, my understanding, and I actually do have a background in criminology and working with criminals, my understanding is that, at least in where I've worked, stranger murders are very rare. So the idea that somebody would be raped and killed on the street is actually very rare where I work. And also that rarely did the victim's behaviour play a big role in it. That is, it was much more the offender's predisposition, and the victims were generally fairly random. And so even if you could probably have convinced every single woman not to be drunk and alone at night, you may well not be preventing many murders. So I think the key point here is that we disagree, and that I've yet to see any really strongly evidence-based evidence offered for this. That people assert this as a matter of common sense. Now, as good skeptics, we know that the common sense in this case is hardly a good argument. Our intuition about the way that people behave and what would or would not prevent a murderer from murdering, we should be well aware that the psychology of human beings is not something where common sense is particularly useful. And so if we are going to make strong claims that victims can prevent themselves from being victimised, we really do need to have some evidence to back that up, and I don't think there is any. Not strong evidence. The weak evidence that I have and that I've come across is that actually it would point in the other direction. So let's get on with the video.
Looking at the issue from an even broader perspective, it seems to me that the issue is a microcosmic representation of Americans' views of freedom of expression as embodied in the Constitution. The issue is not whether Grayson has the right to wear a My Little Pony backpack to school, but whether it's prudent for him to do so.
This is essentially the crux of the argument presented in the video. The idea that you can have the right to do something, but simultaneously that it's not a good idea to do so for pragmatic reasons. Now, to see why this is potentially an issue and why people would disagree, let's consider the case of abortion. Okay? So women in America have the absolute legal right to abortion. Okay? That's been confirmed by the Supreme Court, and it's long-standing. There have been no successful legal challenges. And so, in one sense, what we have is an absolute legal right to abortion. Now, in practice, they can't have it. Very many women are denied that right through the practicalities of picketing and blowing up abortion clinics, forcing them out of business, pushing them over state boundaries. There are whole states where there isn't a single doctor who is prepared to perform abortions due to the pressure that's put on them by the religious right. So the question here is it true, is it still meaningful to say that those women have an absolute right to an abortion if the prevailing practicality is that they can't actually access it? And in the same case, we'd say that, is it still meaningful to say that that child has the right to wear that backpack if the practicalities are that they can't? Now, in my jurisdiction, in law, they actually recognise that this isn't the same, this isn't true. There's a clear concept in law here called constructive dismissal. And the idea there is where, under law, you can still be treated as having been unlawfully dismissed from a job if you quit because your employer was making life too difficult for you at your job. So the idea here is if your employer harasses you to the point where you had no choice but to quit, the law will still recognise that as the employer sacking you unlawfully rather than it being your free choice. And I think actually when we boil it down to it, if you think about it, that when you are under threat of coercion, whether it's physical violence, physical bullying or emotional bullying, that does actually limit your rights. And so to say that, yes, we accept that this child has the right to wear the backpack, but pragmatically he shouldn't, you are actually saying that, I believe, that in practice he doesn't have the right to wear it, not the absolute right. I mean, he still has the right, but it's not a clear-cut right that he would have otherwise if he could do so without harassment. So I think we need to be careful about trying to say, yes, he has the right, but he shouldn't do it, because actually what that is doing is undermining his clear right. Anyway, on with the video.
Schools regularly come up in the news for banning certain t-shirts or other items designed to convey a message. Let's get one thing straight right away. Schools are entitled to set and enforce whatever dress code they like. If they want to say that the colour pink is banned, that's up to them, and if parents don't like it, they're welcome to object in the appropriate forums or withdraw their children.
Now, I don't want to get your argument wrong here. So I just want to clarify, I agree with you to the point that schools should have a right to regulate what the students wear at school to some extent. I don't agree if you literally meant that they have the right to enforce any dress code or uniform that they see as fit. I mean, the obvious absurd example is a dress code of complete nudity. I believe that obviously the dress codes that they should be allowed to enforce really should be limited to within some kind of reasonable bounds and based on evidence. So when they say, well, we're going to ban this because it's offensive, there should actually be some good evidence behind that it is actually offensive and some reasoning. So if you're going to ban something for offensiveness, that's a good reason. If you're going to ban something because disruptive, that's a less good reason. The other thing I think that is a strong caveat here is I think that obviously these rights are stronger in private schools. In a public school, I actually kind of disagree. Here we have compulsory education and we have compulsory public schooling. So if you can't afford to send your child to a private school, then you must send your child to a public school. We also have a catchment area system whereby there is one public school for most people. Most people have one public school they can send their child to. They don't actually have a choice in that matter. And in that case, I think actually it should not be the fiat of the principal or whoever to just simply enforce a dress code on thing. Yes, there's probably proper channels to go through, but I think there should be strong limits on. I think a dress code should only be a limitation to something reasonable and rational. Aside from that caveat, I agree. Racist, homophobic, and bigoted statements, should be banned on school kids' clothing.
Furthermore, even freedom of speech does not permit hate speech or fighting words. So when smart-ass kids go to school or a prom wearing a Confederate flag t-shirt or dresses, they are making a political and most likely racist statement. In my view, while school should be a place where minds are stimulated, it is not appropriate for students to disrupt whatever small harmony may exist by turning every second of every day into a political rally, especially when espousing opinions of bigotry.
I generally agree with you here that schools should certainly seek to minimise the disruption to classes, etc., and should be reducing homophobia, etc. But I also think that this is a fairly complex issue and one I don't have a good answer to. And I think we should always be careful about abridging the free speech of any person just because it's offensive. This is a deep issue, but actually I kind of feel this is an aside to the main issues. So I'm going to leave this one for the time being and maybe I'll have a better think about it.
So to go back to Grayson and his backpack, there are two sides to the issue: how his mother behaved and how the school reacted. The boy was being bullied as a direct reaction to the clothing he was wearing.
What you've just said is completely wrong. This child was not bullied in direct reaction to the backpack he was wearing. That is suggesting that the bullies had simply it was like almost a reflex in them to bully the child as a result of his backpack wearing, and that simply removing the backpack would remove the bullying. This is almost certainly not the case. Now, I don't know the case in much detail, but I do know something about bullying and I do know a lot about human behaviour. And to suggest that the backpack was the sole and main cause is to ignore everything that we know about bullying. Now, I think maybe what you were saying was you were sort of overstating the case there to make a point. But let's bear in mind that those bullies bullied that kid because he was different, and whether he wore a backpack or not, he was almost certainly going to be different anyway. And whether he wore a backpack or not, those bullies would almost certainly have bullied someone. So let's not suggest that the problem of bullying is about removing of this backpack. This one issue is bigger than just simply one kid with a backpack. And the issue in that school, I would be prepared to bet money, is more than just one kid wearing a backpack. I doubt if you remove that backpack, suddenly there will be no bullying, as was suggested by that statement. Let's be clear here. Those bullies bullied for a number of reasons. They have their own motivations and drives. They have their own background. They have their own family life, all of which will be a driver in this. And exactly who they select and exactly the manner in which they bully will almost certainly have something to do with the backpack. But the fact that they're bullying and the number of bullies and the extent of bullying in that school has very, very little to do with one child's decision to wear that backpack.
It's all very easy to declare in sweeping statements the school should have dealt with the bullying, but unless you've ever worked in a school, you have no idea how close to impossible that can be. There are 1,000 little ways in every day that bullies can torment a boy well under the radar of any teacher. A little word here, a little nudge there, exclusion from their games, isolation from his friends, campaigning against him, and far more besides. Schools simply don't have the resources to monitor any student that closely, and quite frankly, as in rape accusations, it often comes down to the victim's word against the bullies. Schools are not equipped or trained to evaluate bullying allegations, and there's a constant background noise of whining by children about other children.
Okay, so there's two issues here. Firstly, there's the practicality. So yes, schools are underfunded, staff in schools aren't well trained to deal with bullying, etc., etc. And I'm not sure how true this is in all jurisdictions, but, I'll accept that. The answer there is not simply to turn around and go, well, there's nothing we can do. The answer there is to push for better training, for more funding, etc., etc. Now, I would hope, I don't actually know the case, but I would hope that some of the supporters of this child, that's exactly why they would be highlighting this case, is with the hope that it will actually gain better funding, better training for all involved so that such things can be reduced. Now, the other thing is that there seems to be a hidden premise here, that you're suggesting that the school couldn't do anything about the bullying because they couldn't follow this child around constantly and stop them from being bullied, and there's other ways that the children can bully him that the teachers wouldn't be able to notice. Now, the hidden premise here is that the way to deal with bullying is to stop the discrete incidents of bullying. It's the same in the rape case. The argument there is that the way to prevent rape is through preventing the discrete rape occurrences. Whereas actually what we know is the most, especially in the case of bullying, that the most effective ways that a school can do to prevent bullying in general, and bullying in particular actually, is a broader school-based systemic approach to bullying. This involves educating the students. This involves having certain policies and practices in place so that the issues that give rise to bullying can be addressed before they actually result in bullying. These kind of supportive stuff at school levels actually works really well to reduce the level of bullying. Will it ever eliminate it? No. Kids bully. That's part of the growing up process, and developmental stuff is to identify out groups and people who are different and to mock them. But it is much easier to deal with those incidents if you've already reduced it to the point where there is a general school culture that such things are unacceptable. For example, if I happen to be an educator in this school, one thing I might think about doing is having a My Little Pony backpack myself. Why? That seems ridiculous. No, actually, having the staff publicly and clearly supporting the victim actually sends a strong message to all of the kids. Now, you might think that would get the victim picked on, and maybe in the short term that kind of thing. So you might need to be a bit careful. But generally speaking, a strong support from the staff for the victim actually goes a long way to reducing these kind of bullying. And even if it doesn't in this case, it will instill a culture within the school where bullying is not acceptable, and that itself will reduce the amount of bullying. This is what, and now, you may say, well, I'm just spouting. This is actually what the evidence shows. So there is a body of evidence about how to do bullying prevention. There is some world-class quality research done into it. Now, there's not a huge amount because these kinds of things are not spearheaded by scientists. They're spearheaded by people who don't necessarily have a massively scientific viewpoint. And so the quality of research is not always fantastic. But that's where the evidence points. What evidence we do have points to a more systemic approach, that is dealing with the entire school system rather than the one particular incident of bullying. And so if we're going to be sceptical, if we're going to be rational about this, we need to go where the evidence shows. And the evidence is not that the school needs to get a teacher to follow this child around all the time. Actually, it's that the school needs to do training with its staff and these kind of boring things, and having sort of strong policies and building a strong staff culture and even a student culture. You can do things like buddying and mentors, where you get the child who's been bullied and you find a strong and popular child who agrees to be his buddy. These actually work wonders. So let's not get caught up in what is common sense approaches to stopping bullying. Let's look at actually where the evidence goes.
Given the reality of this situation and the fact that the school has a duty of care to ensure the boy's safety, they took the prosaic approach and told him not to wear the backpack to school. Now I hear ultra-libs howling that this is victim blaming, just as it is when you suggest that a woman might want to be mindful of what she wears in certain locations. But it's not. It's not blaming anyone. It's taking a prosaic approach.
Note, there's a few issues here. So when you say the school took the prosaic approach, what that actually meant is they took the approach that was easiest for them, i.e. the approach that required the least effort from the school. Now, given their budgetary constraints, etc., etc., I can understand why they did that, but it doesn't make it the right approach. Okay, this is typically what happens in these situations. So the school took the decision to ban the child from wearing the backpack because that was easiest for them. Interestingly, also, it wouldn't actually reduce the rate of bullying in the school overall. This suggests that the school was not itself interested in reducing bullying per se. They were just interested in reducing the visibility of such bullying. And in fact, the actions of the school to take out the actions against the victim, i.e. to make the victim stop doing something, can be seen as tacitly encouraging the bullies. That is, they get away with it. Now, any school where bullies can feel like they're getting away with it is one where more bullying is likely to occur, just simply by operant conditioning. I don't think that's a massive factor in it, but it's certainly going to be a factor. Now, the second thing is there's a little section of the video there about John Short, the missionary. So the idea of victim blaming. Okay, let's step back here. Let's think about this John Short guy. He's a missionary. He went to North Korea, even though everybody knew, and probably him, that he'd get locked up in North Korea and probably expelled and possibly even tortured. I don't know what they do there. Is that victim blaming to say he shouldn't have gone there? Now, the answer is it's victim blaming whenever you're suggesting that his punishment fitted his crime when it's patently clear it didn't. That's what the victim blaming is. So what was his crime? His crime was to illegally enter North Korea, right? Now, if you're suggesting that deserved torture, then yes, that's victim blaming. If you're saying that it didn't deserve torture, but that he should have foreseen it, sure, I'll accept that, not victim blaming. But you have to be clear to say that he did not deserve to be, say, tortured. He did deserve to be locked up. That's what we do with people who illegally enter our country, and he did deserve to be expelled. That's what we do when people illegally enter our country. I'll accept that. Let's look at the idea of rape and the guy with the backpack. So, what offence has this child committed? He has worn a backpack that was not socially acceptable. He's behaved in a non-socially acceptable manner. What was the punishment? Bullying. If you are to suggest that somehow he should modify his behaviour, that is victim blaming. Now, I know you're upset. Some of you will be upset and defensive. Some of you will be saying, oh, bullshit, whatever. That is literally what is meant by victim blaming, is you're suggesting that the victim is responsible for the punishment they received. That is, because they knew that they were going to get that punishment, they are responsible for it. Okay? Let's take this to a little bit more an extreme example. Let's say you have a father who is an alcoholic and you are a young child, and your father tells you that if you are bad, he will belt you with his belt. You as a child, you behave poorly. Let's say you cry. He belts you with the belt. Is it victim blaming to say that the child shouldn't have cried? Yes, it is. It is absolutely victim blaming. That child had the right to cry. That is what children do. This child has the right to wear his backpack. That is what he does. Any other suggestion, as I've previously said, erodes the idea that he has the absolute right to wear it and is in fact victim blaming. This is the same with rape victims. When we say that they maybe should think about what they're wearing because that was a contributing factor, we are victim blaming. We are saying that some portion of the responsibility for their rape falls to them. That's essentially what we're saying. Here's the responsibility. So we're saying, I don't know, 99% of the responsibility is the rapist's. But 1% is yours because you wore something that made that rapist choose you. Made that rapist. See, again, I'm framing it in terms of the victim making the rapist. That is victim blaming. Now, it's not the worst victim blaming. The worst victim blaming is where we say the rapist had no choice but to rape you and it was entirely your fault for being a slut. Now, this is actually interestingly the kind of thing the Catholic Church was saying about 40 years ago about altar boys. They were saying the altar boys seduced the priests. That's the worst kind of victim blaming. But just because it's not the worst kind doesn't mean it is a kind of victim blaming. So it's down the spectrum from that. I accept that. But to suggest that any part of the responsibility for the rape was the victim's is, by definition, victim blaming. I hope that explains that case. Now, you might want to say, but it's not blaming. I'm not blaming the victim. Well, you are saying the victim was responsible for it. And basically, we're playing semantics about whether you are comfortable using the word responsible or blaming. And, if you look at the dictionary definitions, there's not a lot of distinction, apart from the connotations of condemnation in blame rather than in responsibility. So if you want to say it's victim responsibilitying, yeah, okay, I can buy that.
Feminists often retort with, "Don't tell me what I should wear. Teach your son not to rape." Such comments are asinine and facile soundbites. Males already know that it's wrong to rape. It's just that many of them don't care. You might as well say, teach your daughters not to become shoplifters or child beaters. The issue is not primarily one of education, although I certainly accept that more education delivered in a meaningful way can help. The issue is that some people simply place their own desires ahead of those of others, even when enacting those desires leads to the pain or even death of other people. It amazes me that rational, articulate people such as Rebecca Watson and some grey bloke seem incapable of acknowledging one simple reality. The fact that all the education and punishment and vigilance and moral outrage against rape will not eliminate rapists.
So you've just said something that is actually commonly said in these situations when talking about these issues and is actually not true. So you said that society teaches men not to rape, and that is false. How is that possible, you say? Well, society gives men the message of do not rape, okay? That doesn't teach men not to rape. So it's a different thing. Imagine I told a child to ride a bike, but I didn't teach a child how to ride the bike. That's what society's doing. It's akin to don't do drugs. So simply sending the message of don't do drugs is not teaching a child not to do drugs. It's telling a child not to do drugs. And that's the same with rape. So we tell boys don't rape, but we don't teach them how not to. What's the difference? Well, there was actually some interesting research that came out of the UK where they took statements from rapists about why they'd rape their victims and how they justified it to themselves and various beliefs that they had around this. And then they also took some statements from lads magazines, I think they're called, like Zoo or something like that. And they presented them to test subjects, and members of the general public essentially could not reliably tell the difference. That is, what these men who had raped people were saying were indistinguishable from the statements in these lads magazines. So when you say that we told these kids not to rape, these boys who'd then grown into these rapist men not to rape, yeah, we told them that, but also in our society we had sent them messages that were pro-rape. Not messages that said go and rape, but messages that had supported the rape behaviour. So we know in human psychology that usually any behaviour that we have, a complex behaviour like raping somebody, is supported by a number of beliefs. And now these beliefs are not directly rape is okay, but they are beliefs around that kind of thing. So that, if a woman is dressed in a provocative manner, that means that she is sexually available. Some women say no but really mean yes, and will change their mind if you keep pushing. These are the kind of beliefs that rapists hold, and they don't just get them from some crazy place in the sky. They come from things like men's magazines. To a lesser extent, they also get the message that whenever there is a story about how a victim had been walking alone and drunk and had been raped or murdered, to a lesser extent, rapists and murderers are hearing these stories before they commit their offence. And they are getting the message, to some extent, that there is some responsibility on the victim. And that's why feminists are so particularly outraged when well-meaning people are willing to repeat that idea. Because it reinforces those beliefs that we know. Now, none of those beliefs absolutely lead to, because that's not the way that human psychology works, but those beliefs support those kind of behaviours. And if you accumulate enough of those beliefs and you find yourself in a situation where there's an opportunity and you've got other sort of dispositional things, then the rape happens. And so we know that every little bit of that, if we can remove brick by brick, if we can remove enough bricks, we can reduce the incidence of rape. Now, you're right that no amount of howling and no amount of screaming about education, etc., will ever eliminate rape or rapists. But then that's that fallacy of all or nothing. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't reduce it. And we are pretty sure there is good evidence that rape comes from these dodgy beliefs about women and responsibility for crime, etc. And every time somebody repeats those beliefs, they are furthering this rape culture. Now, it's been called rape culture because these are the beliefs that support rape. It's a horrible thing to hear, especially when when you are yourself a completely anti-rape, but you find yourself saying these things. But yeah, every time somebody repeats this idea that women are at least partially responsible, a little bit, for their rape, that is actually perpetuating some small part of this rape culture. And that's why feminists are against it.
They railed against Thunderfoot for daring to suggest that perhaps in addition to teaching that rape is wrong, one of the ways in which we can minimise it is to take a prosaic look at our own behaviour and ask if there's anything that we can do that reduces our chance of becoming a victim.
Aside from points I've already made about why, even though it might be strictly factually correct, it's actually unhelpful for people to push this, to talk about this thing in general. Part of the reason why people are very upset when these things happen is because for a man to talk about what he can do to reduce the incidence of him being raped, when really what he's talking about is women being raped, actually, especially when that man has no qualifications in that area, that is particularly galling to people who are at high risk of being raped, people who have been raped, or people who are or women who are under the threat of rape. So, although there may be a strict logical truth to the things that he was saying, which I'm not sure because I haven't actually watched the video, it's still not particularly helpful for men to weigh in on this when they have no real qualifications other than their manness. That's particularly galling to a lot of people. And you might say that's really hypocritical because I'm jumping in here to say this. Well, actually no, because I'm making this video for you as a man. So this is a man-to-man discussion. I wouldn't dare make a video that was suggesting to rape victims how they should or should not behave. Because you know what? Even if I was right, they are already paying the consequences of their behaviour. Even if I'm right, they're still suffering. And so I wouldn't dare do that because I don't think it would be helpful. Anyway, let's keep going.
A black person has the right to walk alone through the middle of a KKK rally, but no right-thinking person would suggest that he does so, because such an action has consequences, tantamount to a death wish. At best, such an action would be ridiculously naive, and at worst, it's outright provocative. Either way, any African American who did so had better have skills like Bruce Lee, because there's a lot of pissed off bigots just waiting to stand their ground.
Okay, so here's a really good example of what I was talking about before when I was saying that you can't simultaneously say that somebody has an absolute right to do something, but on the other hand, they really shouldn't do it. These two things actually contradict each other in a subtle way. So I actually agree with you that a black person has the absolute right to walk through a KKK rally, and they also have a right to expect not to be the subject of violence. And if you think about the civil rights movement, a big part of the civil rights movement in the US was about the government actually wholeheartedly supporting the rights of their black citizens. Usually it's the federal government against the state governments. So when the state governments refused to respect the human rights of their black citizens, the federal government stepped in, and a huge number of these, the sort of defining moments of the civil rights rallies, of the civil rights movement, was about federal government standing, as their representatives, often the National Guard, potentially the National Guard or federal FBI or something like that, standing shoulder to shoulder with black people to ensure that they could actually exercise these rights. Okay? Now, you are absolutely right when you draw a dichotomy about what is the advice I would give to one particular person in one particular situation versus what the society should be doing in general and the correct course that we should be taking. So I think I get your point that in one hand, if you had one person who had this one situation, the advice would be don't do it if you value your life. But on the other hand, my other advice would be do it. I will stand right next to you and we will bring the police with us and we will bring the army with us or whoever we need to. We'll bring the full force of the state to ensure that your rights are not infringed, because that's what the state needs to stand for in every case. It's not a right if you can't exercise it. It's not a right if you can't exercise it. So yeah, every black person has the right to walk through a public KKK rally and not be molested, and the government should be expected to ensure those rights are respected. And if they don't, we should be hammering on the government to do so. Every single time.
I completely understand that it's a shitty world where bullies make a little boy miserable for wearing a My Little Pony backpack to school. And I love Grayson's love of the wholesome and innocent simplicity of this good-natured cartoon. But the harsh reality is, schools are melting pots for hundreds of kids coping with emotional issues, who lack the maturity and self-awareness to work them through in responsible manners. The one who is different is an easy target. That's not fair, that's not right, but it is reality.
Now, I don't want to besmirch you on this one, and I don't want to weigh in trying to defend every defender of this boy, because I don't know what their motives are. But when we're confronted with this, I honestly believe the moral response is not to say, oh well, but to say, and this needs to change. And so I would hope that some of his supporters, the reason why they've had such outrage in the face of this is because they fervently believe that this needs to change. That we need to bring as much fairness as we can into the world, acknowledging that we will never get 100%, but the job of civilization is to try and bring as much as possible, and that we should always be striving for more.
So whilst Mrs. Bruce and all her supporters are waiting for reality to reshape itself into their ideal view of how life should be, perhaps a more productive approach would be to show a little bit of maturity and leadership herself and explain to her son that while she celebrates and wholeheartedly supports his preferences, there are times and places for loudly proclaiming them.
I actually disagree with what you've just said. Maybe not with the sentiment that you're trying to get across. I think the right thing for the parent to do is to say to the son, look, what's going to happen if you keep wearing this backpack? Do you understand? Yes. Do you want to keep wearing your backpack? If so, I will stand by you every step of the way. If not, no problems. Your choice. If the child doesn't understand the consequences, explain what the likely consequences are going to be and allow this child to make the choice. Not to say to them, hey, there's a time and a place for everything. No, the time and the place is when that child decides it's that time or that place. I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to get onto, and I'll make more comments after that.
I'm a karate instructor. Often my young students want to attempt a new rank before they are ready. They argue that they can cope with the disappointment of failure, but I've seen too many students quit after failing a rank test, because it's one thing to contemplate the abstract concept of failure, but when you're the only failure in a room full of kids who has just passed, the reality is much different. So I show leadership, and unless I believe a student can cope with the disappointment, I strongly discourage them from attempting before they are ready. For some, failure is a lesson that will toughen them, but for many it ruins their confidence. Likewise, it's fine for Mrs. Bruce to hold the high-minded moral opinion that her young son should be able to take a My Little Pony backpack to school, but as someone tasked with guiding that child to adulthood, she may be better to explain that sticking to ethical principles can sometimes destroy you. I'm all for standing by your values, but even the greatest military commander knows you must choose your battles carefully.
Look, I do agree with you to some extent here, and I think you're right. We do need to choose our battles carefully. But that doesn't mean that we should shy away from battles. That simply means that we should choose our battles. And in this case, this child should choose his battles. Now, I don't really know a lot about this case, actually, and I'm not going to criticise anybody else's parenting, because I understand that it's such a complex issue that somebody on the outside with barely any knowledge of the actual situation can barely ever give any decent advice. But certainly I can talk from my own perspective, and while you're right, I would try to lead my child in the best way possible. I would also allow big opportunities for failure. Failure is not something to be shied away from. And even in the example you give of karate, to some extent, if a child drops out of karate, that may well be a developmental experience for them. And so I would not discourage my child from trying, because I am not afraid of him failing. I'm not afraid of myself failing. And so in this case, I would say that I would be much more in favour of the child making their own decision about whether to wear the backpack, and I would support them to the hilt.
American atheists has clearly failed to recognise this fact, and by churlishly asserting themselves at each and every opportunity, in spite of the tactical or humane wisdom of doing so, they have created enemies that they didn't need to create. Opposing the 9/11 cross was a typical example of why even other atheists are sometimes embarrassed to share the same label as them. We all recognise that the Westboro Baptist Church picketing the funerals of dead soldiers was monstrously insensitive, yet how was the 9/11 memorial protest any better?
I can't comment specifically about the American atheists I can't comment in general because I'm not American and I'm not aware of all the nuances. And I sometimes think that these groups do tend to go for things which are silly targets, and they should reserve their energies and efforts for bigger targets. But I do think there is quite a big difference between the American atheists and the Westboro Baptist Church. For one, the American atheists actually support a larger number of people, so they have dues that are paid to them. And so when they oppose something, presumably they're acting in the interests of a broader constituency than just these few whack jobs of the Westboro Baptist Church. Secondly, they're arguing from a sound legal position. So when they say that the government shouldn't recognise particular religions in memorials, this is straight out of the Constitution. When the Westboro Baptist Church says that God hates fags, they are arguing straight from some whacked version of Christianity that somebody just made up. So the arguments they're advancing are quite different. I also suspect that arguing in, say, court about the 9/11 cross is somewhat less insensitive than actually turning up to the funeral of a dead soldier, holding placards and saying God hates fags and God killed your son because there are fags in the army. So actually I do think there is a bit of a difference, even though I don't particularly support a lot of what American atheists do.
The point is, of course, everybody recognises that freedom of expression, be it wearing a skimpy bikini, a Confederate t-shirt or a My Little Pony backpack, is a principle that we can all support. However, any person that is naive enough to believe that availing themselves of that right at any time is without consequences is a fool.
Okay, let's not conflate reasonable consequences of free speech with unreasonable consequences. So, if I say that the Prophet Muhammad was a child rapist, what are the reasonable consequences? That my Muslim friends won't like me, that I won't be invited to the mosque, right? These are reasonable consequences for my behaviour. What are unreasonable consequences? That somebody comes around and firebombs my house and I get beheaded, okay? So yes, free speech has consequences, but the role of the government and in society in general is to make sure that all of these consequences are reasonable and to try to eliminate or remove those consequences that are unreasonable. Yeah?
Nurturing the courage to be yourself is a valuable exercise, but not at the expense of your sanity or your life. Whining about the right to wear a bikini to a redneck bar whilst you are getting raped will be little deterrent to the rapist and little comfort to you. Likewise, complaining that bullying shouldn't be allowed once your young son's confidence has been forever shattered is not the action of a responsible, loving parent. It's the action of a fool who places her principles above her child's well-being.
So here's the thing. We're actually sort of conflating two issues. So there is the general societal issue of how in general should we deal with rights violations? How much pressure should we put on those people whose rights are being violated to adjust their behaviour so that their rights are no longer violated because they're no longer asserting them? And how much pressure should we put on the violators to stop violating other people's rights? And to use my example of how much responsibility did the victim have for being murdered, right? If you're saying that the victim had 1% responsibility for the actions of the murderer, then we should put 1% of our responsibility, our actions, into trying to persuade people to act in a way that doesn't get them murdered. And we should be spending 99% of our time and effort trying to stop people from murdering. Now, if you look at YouTube, that's not what's happening. Now, I know there are other sections of, the police, etc., who are responsible for catching murderers, etc., etc. But when you look at the discourse, when you look at the way that videos on YouTube and the media, etc., presents it, is we don't have a 99% of the time, let's look at the violator and the perpetrator and how horrible they are and people shouldn't do this, and this is the path that led them to this so that you too can get off the path if you're heading that way. We have simplistic condemnations followed by often it's almost equal time spent on the victim, right? And in this case, I would bet that it's only the little boy who was looked at. I bet the people who were bullying him were not given any coverage at all. So we're not following our let's apportion it to the responsibility apportionment. Now there's that issue, and the thing that it's getting conflated with is in a particular situation, what do you do? And actually I think in this particular situation, let's say I have a daughter, and let's say she's 5 and she wants to go out at night, okay? At 5, she doesn't know what she's doing. I stop her. Absolutely. There's no argument. There's no discussion. There's no, blah, 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 blah. As she gets older, let's say she's 13 and wants to go out, then we have a discussion about possible consequences, and we have a discussion about these kind of things, and then she and her negotiate some kind of decision. So it is partially her choice and partially my choice, because this is teaching her how to make good decisions in the future, okay? When she's 18, she's an adult. And let's say she tells me that she plans to go out and get absolutely blind drunk and stagger home in skimpy outfit in the wee hours of the morning through a dodgy area of town. What is my response? My response is to make sure that she understands what the possible consequences of these actions are and to offer her any support. I may, if she doesn't understand what the possible consequences are, I may attempt to explain to her what the consequences are. In fact, I will. And I will do my best to have her understand it, and then I will offer her absolute support. And that's it. And these are the basic principles. So when your child is very young and can't make good decisions, you make the decisions for them. As they get older, you negotiate, and you explain to them the consequences so they understand it, and then you allow them to have a negotiated consequence. And when they're adults, and it's their choice. And we don't at all hold them accountable for the actions of other people. At least I don't. So that's where feminists are coming from. Now, I'm sorry that this is so long, and I'm sorry if I've offended you unnecessarily. The idea here also is everything I've just said then about the way that I would approach my child comes from some evidence about parenting. This comes from how to teach children to make good decisions so that they grow up to be adults with good decision-making skills. This is not rock-solid evidence that we would like to have, but there is good evidence in that direction, okay? There really isn't much other evidence out there. So I've tried in this video to talk about things that are evidence-based. I haven't presented all the evidence. I would